All right, let's talk about how you appeal to an audience. So, when we're talking about appealing to an audience, on the surface, that's pretty simple, but sometimes kind of enacting those persuasive strategies that we see in others people writing is a little bit easier said than done. So, what we've done is we've kind of broken it down into 3 strategies that we're going to go over to help you make the most of your persuasive writing. So, the first thing is that when we're looking for what appeals to an audience, it really comes down to 2 things. One is that whatever you're arguing is made relevant to them and they can see that relevance. And 2 is that you have strong evidence to back it up. Those are kind of the 2, I guess, most profound, most universal ways to be persuasive. Like I said, to both make it relative to your audience and to also provide the facts to back it up. So we have 3 strategies to kind of do both of those things. Starting with relevance, which means how does it affect me? Because you and I both know that if we're sitting in an argument, what's going to change my mind is really the effect it's going to have on me as the individual, right? So let's talk about how we make arguments relevant. The first way is this idea of big ideas. So these are universal, abstract values, ideas, things that every human can understand. For example, we all understand what despair is. We all know what unity is. We all understand truth. These are just kind of those big abstract concepts that permeate all of life and all of literature, right? So, in order to make a topic relevant, if we can connect to one of these big ideas and make that human connection with our audience, it can go a long way. So, for instance, if we're looking at a persuasive essay, while it does have a specific task, like is lined out on the prompt sheet, we can still think about the bigger picture. A good example would be the windmills synthesis prompt we've looked at. While on the surface, that prompt is about identifying what people should consider if they're going to build wind farms. It's also about conservation and nature and beauty. It's about money and wealth. There's a lot of different big ideas that we can connect to that would fit with that prompt. And when we do that, we're kind of making it more persuasive because we're connecting to things that people understand, right? If we talk about nature and conservation, that's something people care about. And if I use that in my introduction and my conclusion throughout my essay, I can build a stronger, more persuasive essay that isn't just about windmills, but it's about the bigger picture, right? So that's one way to make essays relevant, kind of connecting to these big ideas. Another way to make your arguments relevant is to look at what we call the social contexts. So, different ways of looking, or different perspectives, I think is the best word, of looking at a problem. So, when we sit and think about what issues might arise with a wind farm, things like cost come up, there's loss of jobs, there's the effect on nature, the advantages that it can provide. But if we can kind of think through different perspectives, we can get a broader understanding of the argument. And then, even if we get a question that's really tough and narrow, we can look at it from a lot of different ways. So, PEEPS is the acronym for these different perspectives. So, you'll see on my chart over there, the first one is pragmatic. And pragmatic is a fancy word for feasible or reasonable, right? If something, if we're going to look at the pragmatic argument, we're going to talk about, is it even possible? How is it going to work, right? So, for example, with the windmills prompt, how are you going to go about building all these? Do we have the resources available to make that happen? Do we have the workforce able to make that happen? That would be a pragmatic approach. The next one is economic, and that's what's the cost, right? What are the costs? What are the benefits? And is it worth it? Anytime we're making an economic analysis, we're looking for that bottom line, so to speak, right? And it's usually a pretty persuasive way of looking at an argument. So those of you that might have mentioned the cost in your windmills prompt, or your thesis, I should say, that would be using the economic perspective. The next E stands for ethical. And that's kind of like we've talked about ethos in the past, right? But is it the right thing to do? Is it morally right to implement whatever the prompt is suggesting be implemented? Now, for the windmills prompt, it might be difficult to make an ethical argument for sure. But for a lot of prompts, this is a good approach to think about, to consider right and wrong and how it fits into good character morals. The next one is psychological. So that is, how is it going to affect the individual, particularly how is it going to affect them psychologically? So if we're using, again, the windmills prompt, if one of your considerations was the possible job loss that could occur with the implementation of wind energy, that could be um, a psychological argument. If you talk about the strain it puts on those individuals, not coal in your job is going to have a terrific emotional effect on them, that would be a psychological argument. The S in P stands for sociological. So that's kind of the bigger picture. How is it going to affect all of us? So those are the big questions about society. So this is where, if you were going to make the argument about moving forward in terms of climate change, that'd be more sociological, because you're talking about the current generation and future generations. So we're talking about the big picture, and that would be a sociological approach. So these two, the big ideas and PEEP strategies, are to help you figure out how to make an argument relevant and effective. But we can also talk about strong evidence. So how are you going to prove it? Now, in the essays we've looked at, rhetorical analysis and synthesis, they give you the evidence. It's in the passage or it's in the synthesis sources. But question 3 is going to ask you to do it yourself, which is a little intimidating. And the thing that I always notice with students and as a reader is that we kind of rely on the evidence that's easier instead of maybe the evidence that's going to be more compelling. So looking at our next acronym, SHORE, is kind of just categories of thinking about evidence and kind of getting your brain to move into different categories than the first one that occurs to you, so to speak. So the first letter is S, and that stands for science and technology. So if there is any scientific proof or technological advancement that relates to a prompt, that's a great category of evidence, because it's hard to refute science. I mean, lately people are trying, but we could definitely use science as strong evidence for a prompt. The H then stands for history. So what in the past has happened that's relevant to whatever you're talking about. So if we are going to talk about school uniforms, for example, and I wanted to bring in historical evidence, I might talk about how military uniforms have adapted in the past so that they create a sense of community between soldiers, and that same sense of community could happen with school uniforms. I mean, the history would be kind of hard with school uniforms, but I could definitely use it. The O in SHORE stands for observations. So things like news and pop culture. Again, using that school uniform topic, there is so much in social media and pop culture right now about dress codes and dress code restrictions and reactions on social media and on the internet, that I could refer to that, and that would be evidence. It'd be better if I had a specific instance, right? But that would be some really compelling observational evidence. The fourth category is R, or reading, and that's pulling from reading you've done in fiction, in nonfiction, anything that's kind of relevant to the prompt again, and thinking about how that could fit into a school uniform prompt or argument. You could talk about how a book maybe advocates for individuality over conformity. You could talk about if you've read a book in which there is explicit examples of school uniforms. But really anything that comes from your reading is good evidence. And then E is the experience. So experiences of others and of yourself. Now, that's pretty straightforward, things that have happened to you that are relevant to whatever the prompt is. But what I like about this acronym is that starting at the top, that's your strongest evidence. Scientific evidence is hard to refute. As you move down through history, observations, readings, and experience, they kind of lose that integrity a little bit as they go down, just because they either can have more bias in them, or that evidence just isn't as universally compelling. So what I want to talk about particularly is personal evidence. or personal experience. Sorry. This is an example from when I was a reader a few years ago, and I was reading question 3. And I like to call her Burrito Girl. This is not an actual picture of Burrito Girl, but I thought it was funny, so I included it. But this is an example, or this is 2 examples rather, of personal experience that's really compelling and personal experience that's not. So the prompt that year was asking if there is value in the unknown, and if there is value, what is that value? Um, so we have 2 examples here. The first is from an exceptional essay we read, and then Burrito Girls is the second one. But I'll start with example 1, which is the better example. A student argued that the unknown is a privilege not available to minorities in America. An example they used was the fear that their parents would not come home at the end of the day because ICE had raided their workplace. This fear made the unknown frightening, not valuable. So this is personal experience that's very unique to this person, obviously, but it's really relevant to the prompt because the essay overall was arguing that the unknown is not valuable, particularly for minorities, because it's more scary than it is valuable. So hugely, hugely successful piece of evidence using personal experience. Now, the second example is more so what we see as readers, and unfortunately less successful. Because Burrito Girl argued that the unknown is valuable, because one time her mom made her try a chicken burrito, even though she didn't want to, and that was a good experience with the unknown because she ended up liking it. Looking at those 2 examples, I hope you can see how personal experience can be very successful and how it can be very shallow, immature, and unsuccessful. To example 2's credit, I mean, it is some evidence, but it's definitely not evidence that's going to knock me over and convince me of anything. So when we're talking about appealing to an audience, we need to find that evidence that's best, which is where that SHORE acronym comes in. Start at the top, work your way down, and try to find evidence that's going to be more compelling. So that's our 3 strategies for appealing to audience. 1, big ideas, finding that universal relevance that people can connect to. 2, using those different perspectives to look at a problem and kind of gain new insight as you do so. And then 3, in order to find that really great specific evidence, the SHORE observations, the SHORE acronym for finding evidence.